Great, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Great. Yeah. Thank you for attending the 2012 Urban Forum's Local Area Processes, Theories, Methods, and Models. I'm Kate Cagney from the Department of Sociology and the Population Research Center at the University of Chicago. On behalf of the Urban Network and my colleagues Linda, Louise Hockley, and Terry Clark, and Mario Small will be joining us later in the day, I welcome you to our conference and to an extended conversation on neighborhood context. So one commission of today is to discuss the importance of place. And I was advised that at this moment I'm supposed to insert some kind of NATO joke of some form about NATO, about getting down here, about all the difficulties. But, you know, honestly, I don't have a NATO joke right now. But I hope that throughout the course of the day we'll develop some NATO jokes. By cocktail hour, we'll have several. So at least that will be one thing we'll accomplish today. But apart from all the NATO jokes, we're here to acknowledge the enormous advances in the field over the last 2 decades. We have a great debt to Rob Sampson, to William Joyce Wilson, and others who focus on the process turn and on the development of analyses related to mechanisms. And we want this meeting, and we want to use this meeting to generate future directions. So to look beyond individuals nested in communities, thinking about organizations and about networks, both formal and informal, consider more carefully the role of culture, and introduce new methods and new ways of using established methods. So the schedule in front of you is interdisciplinary by design. I presume you all have the schedule here today. So we're beginning with theoretical perspectives. We're moving to social and cultural mechanisms. We'll then break for lunch. After lunch, we'll collect to talk about spatial and networks, and then we'll close with methodological perspectives. And in that session, we're actually going to design it more like a panel discussion where the participants will draw out questions from one another, and then we'll open it up to the group. This day would not be possible without the Urban Network. The Urban Network is an interdisciplinary research hub at the U of C. It aims to foster collaborations for innovation among researchers, policymakers, students, and others, like our group here today, working on issues in urban social science, broadly defined. In addition, this day would not be possible without the proposal developed by Terry Clark and our broader committee, Linda and Louise, and it was a pleasure developing the program with them. So I should just note here in terms of monetary capital, this meeting is also supported by the Center on the Demography and Economics of Aging, the Center for Cognitive and Social Neuroscience, and the Population Research Center, all at the University of Chicago. In terms of human capital, we owe a huge thank you to Carolyn Auer-Kirk and to her colleagues Patrick Riley, Rachel Hyman, and Michaela Sawyer, who have made this day possible. I should say that I think Carolyn now has a master's degree in disaster preparedness, or all the things we had to think about in terms of making this day come together. I should note, too, that videos from this conference and last year's conference are, that was entitled Rethinking Urban Poverty, are available on the Urban portal. So we've had everyone sign releases today, and so if there's anything you didn't get the first time around, you can pull it up on the Urban Portal website. Since this is in the tradition of the University of Chicago broadly, we invite lots of difficult but not necessarily caustic questions. So please join in our conversation. And with that, I will turn things over to Terry Clark, who will be introducing Rob Sampson and Stephen Durloff. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to introduce Rob Sampson. I'm Terry Clark. A little more than a decade ago when Rob was here, he was driving around Chicago streets day and night with video cameras on both sides, getting detail of all the neighborhoods in Chicago, and then he's encouraged people to look at it, and with his students at Harvard in the last decade or more, they've done some terrific things on local effects. He has a major new volume just out. And a decade or so ago, both he and Mario Small published review papers that cogently articulated the importance of models of local effects. And for a decade, I would say, most of the field has not followed that approach. And so we're trying to really do more and to make good on those encouragements which were in those statements. That is, there's been huge progress methodologically. Luke Ansling and others have done a lot of important work on the method side. And Kate had a conference here maybe 3 years or so ago that was very substantial. impressive, and we're building on that in Chicago in this sense. And with Rob Sampson, formerly of Chicago, now at Harvard, it's a pleasure to have him lead us off. Rob?
Thanks, Terry.
I'm sorry, what is this? Is the same one?
I have a different one.
What's that? No, I know, just the same computer.
Welcome, everybody, while the technical folks are being setting up. So first, let me say it's a real pleasure to be in Chicago, and especially at a conference organized by the University of Chicago. So what could be better for urban scholars? So I feel right at home in the land of caustic comments. I have not forgotten. No, seriously, it's a great pleasure to be here. And the charge I was given was a bit impossibly broad. If I recall, something like theoretical, perspective, not everything, related to urban, local, and so forth. And what I thought I would do is to, in essence, go over some of the key ideas and theoretical perspectives that I think have been important in the neighborhood effects literature in the last, well, you could actually go back 100 years. I mean, this is a long literature. We don't want to necessarily think everything that we're doing now is new, but I think it's important to try to organize some of the thoughts. I'm also going to refer, however, to issues of measures and methods and models, not in any detailed sense. We won't see any equations. But I think that I disagree slightly that we want to separate these things out, the idea that there's theory here and then there's method here, right? And then there's models over here. I mean, they really merge together. And I think that we want to always be going back and forth in terms of sort of the philosophy of science, thinking about the relationship between theory and empirical data. So what I'm going to do is to walk through some results, which you won't see.
We'll see them.
That draw on work in collaboration with others, but also that is heavily influenced by a project that I've been involved with in Chicago. So you're going to get another Chicago taste here. Over the last, 15 years or so, Terry mentioned, roughly in the early 90s, a group of us began working on a project that was going to set out and try to study social context, neighborhood context, and a broad range of human and social behaviors. And that led to a project known as the Project of Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods. And there were lots of papers and ideas that came out of that, I think, that are worth discussing. And recently published a book that's the culmination of much of the work from that project and in additional material and sort of theoretical framework on neighborhood effects. So I will use that, that's okay, as a sort of framework to work through the idea of what are some of the theoretical concepts, essentially, that I think are useful, at least put out on the table for discussion today. And I think it'll work in the sense that the later presentations, so for example on methods, spatial methods, network methods, and so forth, will flow, I think, somewhat naturally. And for example, when I talk about, here we are, magic, space, then Luke Anslin can go into that and drill down a little bit deeper. So, the theme of the conference is local area processes. I'll just shorten that to neighborhood processes. And part of the argument that I want to make is that these processes are also embedded in a larger social structure that we need to take seriously. So, theoretical concepts are important, but I want to make sure that we embed them in some facts. Now, I think that facts tell us something about what our theories actually need to explain or take seriously. So one is just the deep concentration of social phenomena. This is not going to surprise anybody, but I think it's useful to get our bearings, and you don't really need your bearings because you're all from Chicago, but from those outside, I try to give them a bit of an orientation. In the beginning of the book, I sort of do a tour, a walk down, starting actually right outside on Michigan Avenue on Magnificent Mile. But even Chicagoans may not realize that not too far from the Magnificent Mile, in 1929, one of the classics in sociology, Henry Zorbaugh, wrote The Gold Coast and the Slum. You know, we still talk about the Gold Coast and the slum. And it turns out that the area that he was talking about, a specific area that I highlight later in the book, is over about north on Oak and Cambridge Street, which was in 1929 Death Corner. Highest rate of homicide in the city, bodies dropping right and left. It was a concentration of poverty, but it was Italian. Hell's, a variation on Hell's Kitchen. And it's interesting that over the years, that was a troubled area, and today it is, or was, the site of Cabrini Green. So the juxtaposition of social distance between the Gold Coast and the slum unfolded over all of the 20th century, and I think of it as the 21st century Gold Coast and slum. And then if you go down into Douglas, Oakland, Grand Boulevard, you really see the incredible variability in neighborhood context that exists in Chicago, and really in all cities. The alleged slum, although it really is deep pockets of concentrated poverty, but somewhat changing, because Robert Taylor Homes, for example, which existed in Grand Boulevard along South Federal, as I show in a picture in the book, it is a field. I mean, it's really kind of eerie. It's the only way to describe it. When you stand in an expanse of grass that could, there could be kids playing there, and you see downtown in the distance, that was the home of 35,000 people approximately. So neighborhoods do change, but nonetheless the stigma still exists there. And what you see is with the stars, homicide proportional to population varies dramatically, but it also coexists with other phenomena, and particularly child health. And I think this is important. It's going to come up in other dimensions. I think Pat Sharkey will talk a bit about child and cognitive development. But low birth weight, being born less than 2,500 grams, infant mortality. A woman giving birth to a low birth weight baby is quite different than 18-year-old males killing themselves, but yet the phenomena is highly concentrated in the same places. And this tells us, I think, in part, that our theories, how they exist out there in the academic world, demographers study fertility, criminologists study crime, education, people study achievement, and I could go on, and NIH is set up in so many silos that we can't even count them all, that scientifically that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So we have to respect the phenomena, I guess is what I'm saying, and I try to do that in the book by understanding the phenomenon and trying to develop theories that are appropriate. So concentration one, persistence is another one. My colleague Orlando Patterson, a historical sociologist, and one day we're having lunch, he says, why don't sociologists explain continuity? And it was actually a difficult question to answer. We have a bad history in sociology, right? Functionalism, and it's all these dirty words. But on the other hand, there's a strong degree of persistence, not just in Chicago, but in many areas over time, and this needs to be accounted for. This is 40-year period, on poverty. Yes, there's change in the areas that saw interventions near South Side, Douglas, and so forth have changed, but nonetheless, correlation of 0.78. Same community is this high poverty in over 40 years. Think about social change, poverty, riots, outmigration, racial change, increase in crime, and then at the end of the century, decrease in crime, yet overlaying a structure of deep persistence. Chicago is not unique, as some have claimed, in many of these dimensions. This is every single census tract in the United States at the top. This is welfare before and after welfare reform of Clinton. These lines are exactly parallel. I could show you poverty, I could show you some other things. The fundamental feature of this, I think, is fairly stable. Here's another example of how secular change is superimposed on local context. We all know, I just gave a talk in New York yesterday, that's all they can talk about. Crime declined, everything's different. Well, yes and no. Crime declined, that's the red arrow, about 50%. These two lines are quite amazing by social science standards. These are prediction lines over 10 years of robbery and homicide rates. Virtually a straight line, meaning that communities are declining, but the pecking order really isn't changing at all. We can talk about minor deviations, but those are pretty strong lines. So that's another thing we have to keep into account. Incarceration, similarly situated, perhaps even more profoundly so. So we have state reactions now, not just the commission of crime by individuals, but the reaction by the state. And what I found interesting about this is 10-year persistence in incarceration removal from communities. In this case, of course, incarceration was increasing. So crime goes down, persistence, incarceration is going up, the removal. But notice the racial differences. One way to think about this is these are all white, predominantly white communities. The white community with the highest rate of incarceration is 40 times differential from the highest rate black community. Now that's the difference of kind, right? Not degree. So there's something fairly profound about this. And finally, the ACS data can't get us at this, but what about the recession? People say, well, that's changed everything. Yes and no. Poor get poorer and the rich get richer. I have data on CHA relocatees and voucher units post-recession and foreclosure rates in 2009. And basically, if you look at it from concentration of disadvantage in 2000, highly predicted, and some communities, the black dots are high foreclosure rate communities, are all, of course. I mean, it's not surprising, but when you see it, the tenacious hold is, I think, rather remarkable. So these are some of the things that our theories have to explain, I think. One is clearly neighborhood concentration. Secondly, across diverse phenomena. Now, we could have a discussion all day on general versus specific theory. Now, I'm not saying the etiology of each one of these things is exactly the same, but nonetheless, respecting the phenomena and trying to understand how these things go together is important. Thirdly, persistence. Despite change, I am not arguing that there's no change. In fact, a good part of the book is about change, but how it's systematically structured and how that change is part of what we might think of as the social structure or the social order of the city. And again, not in a teleological or functionalist way that it's going in some inherent direction, but nonetheless that the processes are reinforcing inequalities at a deep level. I think of it as a deep structure. So I'm going to fly through this. Sorry, but it's early. We all have caffeine, right? Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods. Two basic components. I think of it as two studies in one. One is a multi-method study of neighborhoods, and that's the idea that context needs to be studied as an important unit in and of itself, not just as an appendage to the individual. And I really do think that's a good part of how social science worked up to a certain period. That you have an individual trait, and then you have some kind of neighborhood trait. And you'll see more about this move to try to get serious about measuring neighborhood, involving surveys, as Terry said, observations, going down, videotaping, essentially what Google Street View does now. We made no money off it. We should have thought ahead. The only difference is they have this yellow thing that sticks up and makes it obvious. We had tinted windows. At least we were subtle about it. Because people asked us, why aren't you going to get shot, driving down the street? I sort of wonder if everyone's ever shot at Google. It's an interesting question. I'm sure some are tempted. And leadership surveys. I'll talk a little bit more about those. And then a suite of longitudinal cohort studies following women who are pregnant and their child, essentially enrolled while pregnant, spaced 3-year intervals up to age 18. Okay, just at a very broad level, and this is, I think, in part what the day is about, theoretical theme is really trying to get behind some of the demographics, some of the patterns that we know about in terms of racial composition, in terms of poverty, to the social mechanisms that perhaps are helping us explain those phenomena. We can have a discussion of mechanisms, and I know some of the papers will. Dave Harding talks a bit more about that. I think there's a broad agreement on the need to look at mechanisms and processes, but you'd be surprised at how hard it is to do in terms of the social interactions, the perceptions, the social controls that exist, and that's part of the aim, and that is linked, and that's why I was making the point that we can't separate theory from method, because theory, in a sense, drives method, or it should imply some kind of a methodological perspective, and then that feeds back to the theory. In this case, if you really want to look at this, you need tools and methods, and with Steve Raudenbush, we argued for what we call ecometrics, which is really quite simple. It's just the idea of a metric for ecology. I mean, after all, we have a very precise, long-standing, highly consensual sense of individual measures, testing, and so forth that work well. It helps us to get to the question quickly. Whereas contextual neighborhood research is sort of a morass, and everyone uses different measures. We don't know what their reliabilities are, and they're often, again, not directly measuring what we'd like. So this is both statistical and substantive, and that's why I think that they merge together. So what are some, in terms of theory, I'm just going to go through some of the things that have come out of the project, but also link to long-standing literature. This is not sort of something that comes out of nowhere. Social disorganization theory is long-standing in the field. One of the things that we've looked at is collective efficacy theory, the notion of shared expectations, really shared norms. So there's a cultural element to this, and I think this is picked up on in some of the later talks today. For control, for what happens in a neighborhood if the library needs a new addition, there's kids that are in trouble, hanging out in the streets, not going to school, garbage not being picked up. You can think of a number of different dimensions, but also as it exists with a certain level of working trust and cohesion in the neighborhood. Not dense social ties, friend, kinship networks, but those two things combined, the efficacy, intended action, and the collective or cohesion, we think makes a construct that can be measured with a high degree of reliability based on informant questions. That is, we use a vignette approach about what others expect others to do. And theoretically, and this is not sort of so much a causal model that is tested specifically just like this, but pieces of it in the book, because you have selection processes in terms of how people are moving into neighborhoods that we try to take account of, sort of around the circle, and then spatial and macro level processes, which I'll get to, that neighborhood processes are embedded in these larger things. But nonetheless, structural characteristics like concentration of poverty, disadvantage, bear on collective efficacy. They also bear on violence and disorder and health directly, and collective efficacy with its reciprocal relationship to well-being. And I think, and some of our data show, that dynamics and trajectories are important. This is actually a figure out of the book that shows how changes, and again, I noted how there's persistence, but there's also change, how changes in collective efficacy, but also changes in the concentration of poverty explain the trajectory rate of crime. And maybe one way to simply think about this chart is to say, we know in Chicago, as in New York, as in other cities, violence was dropping. But that is contextual too, that it's differential. So the top line is the rate of change in homicide for communities that were declining and increasing in poverty. And the blue, or I'm sorry, the yellow, not yellow, red, just have yellow, red line, dash dot at the bottom, neighborhoods that are increasing in collective efficacy and are reducing in poverty. And the way this was set up in terms of lags, it's such that I think we can rule out reciprocal relationships here, and this is within individual or within neighborhood change. So it's a trajectory model within neighborhoods and changes in collective efficacy. So it really suggests that not only are there between neighborhood differences, but neighborhood change differences that we can look at. Another concept, which I'm not going to get into in detail, which is related, I think, to the idea of collective efficacy, is the notion of altruism and other regarding behavior. I've become fascinated with this, and there's a chapter on what I call the good community, and it's actually somewhat philosophical in nature, which may drive people a little bit crazy, but it has to do with the notion under which we can think of conditions where behavior is arguably a social good. And because there's a lot of debate in the literature, even in social capital and collective efficacy, about this. To make a long story short, what we did is to conduct a field experiment on returning lost letters. This is a variant of the Milgram experiment, where letters are dropped in public, and thousands and thousands of them, and then addressed, and we can determine whether or not they were returned and where, and then we took into account the conditions under which the drop occurred, and through a long series of procedures, I think, estimate this other regarding behavior. And then also I linked it to a study that looked at the rate of CPR given to heart attack victims in public, on the street. And what's interesting is the CPR rate and the other regarding behavior letter return rate are highly related, even when you control for poverty and other things. So it does suggest this altruistic quality. And in the book, I go through and really talk about these three sort of culturally influence mechanisms, I think, because I think there's a norm of other regarding behavior. I'm not going to say anything more about it today. And also legal cynicism, which others using PhD-CN data have also explored on how there seems to be in certain communities sort of an alienation from institutions, particularly the police, particularly a sense that everyone's out for themselves, it's okay to get around the law, and it leads to this corrosive behavior that undermines well-being. Now I'm going to switch, and again, this is a high level, 30,000 foot, in terms of ideas that we can perhaps come back to. I've been fascinated over the years, more and more so, with what I think of as visual sociology and perceptions, and what we see in the environment and how that affects our behavior, our mindsets, really. And so the book actually has a fair number of pictures. This is Death Corner, by the way. Comes out near the end of the book. You can see the sign, Oak and Cambridge. If you're looking at it this way, behind me is the field now, which was Cabrini, and every time I went there, it's coming down, geese are in the field now. Around the corner here, guys were playing cards, there was some drug dealing, they were trying to sell me drugs half the time I was walking by. Car without hubcaps, BMW, we could talk about what that car might be doing there, shut down. And then there's new sort of mixed income places going up. This is a conflictual area. Munchie's Grocery was 2 blocks away. The guy was shot in the back and killed the last day I was there. So it's still a dicey area. But these are the kinds of things that you can actually fine-tune and get down and see. And what I do, and there's another picture of disorder. Is this disorder? This is the kind of question I got fascinated with. I mean, you see public property, electrical thing, it's defaced. Yeah, on the wall, it's kind of pretty, I would think. Some people might think, right? So some people see this as disorder, the garbage can. It's written on, broken windows. I'm not going to get into the details, but the idea that signs of disorder are, in essence, going to unravel the community and lead to poor health, migration out, crime, right? Because one broken window leads to another. Well, in essence, it doesn't, I argue. It all depends on the context. This, by the way, is situated in one of the highest, priciest blocks in Chicago, in Hyde Park. You have to find it. So, why is that so? Well, because the context within its, where it exists, it has a different meaning, and the context of disorder is socially perceived and understood. And so part of the argument is that you have, this isn't a purely socially constructivist argument in the sense that there's no reality out there. Of course there is. We can measure it, and we think we can do it very well. In social disorder, our perceptions of felt disorder is tied to the observed disorder and also individual perceptions. But the concentration of minority and immigrant groups is strongly related, even among blacks, whites, Asians, others, even among first generation, second generation. In other words, it's not simple prejudice, but rather an overall effect of the context on our perception of disorder. And I think that is due to the macro context where, in fact, disorder is over time has been related to a process of disinvestment in U.S. cities. So therefore, it's not irrational to think that more disorder is linked to the concentration of particular groups given the historical basis, but nonetheless, that takes on a life of its own, which then leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then I go on to look at, well, what then are the influences, and can we think about the perceptions of disorder as in itself the social climate, right? Not just the individual perceptions, but intersubjective perceptions of disorder. And lo and behold, they're quite stable. And I developed the concept of the looking glass neighborhood. Because if you think about it, and we all know about the looking glass self, Charles Cooley's interesting concept, right, from 1902, that, and it's true, that our sense of self is in part, cannot be understood independent of our interactions with others and how others perceive us. And similarly, a neighborhood, right? I mean, it's not that the individual alone is perceiving the neighborhood or perceptions, because it is an interaction with others and what their perceptions are, the reputations of neighborhood. These are reinforced through institutional mechanisms. It's not just real estate, real estate steering, but churches and school teachers and people that work in the community define it such that what I show is that the collective priors, the perceptions of disorder, and that's on the x-axis here, actually predict through time the poverty trajectory of a neighborhood, but in this case, individual perceptions 7 years later. Minor detail here, but it's important. These are different people. This is not a longitudinal follow-up. This is a repeated cross-section. So therefore, these are a random sample of the population in 1995, the perceptions of disorder in a particular area. Then 7 years later, different people, their perception of disorder adjusted for all their individual characteristics, and then for poverty, race, and so forth. The race differences are basically this difference. You can see high observed disorder, high percent black. The actual observed disorder effect is this part. It's not significantly different. The action is in the collective priors. One other thing, you could say, well, there's inside information and so on and so forth. We also replicated this looking at the individual perception of disorder of a community based on elites, like the alderman, like the leader of a particular institution in the community, and I selected out those that lived in the community. So I selected outsiders, those that did not live in the community, and their perception was strongly influenced by the perception of others from before. That suggests a mechanism of reputation that carries over time and has institutional pieces to it, and I get into this more in the book. This is just an overview. Okay, good. I still have a few minutes, I think. And leave time for Steve, because I want to get into this last part, which I think, is that correct, Kate?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes. You're going to have to just drag us all off the stage, you realize that. Beyond the local. We're talking about local processes. So I'm going to be a little subversive and argue that we want to go beyond the local. Actually, Luke's going to go beyond the local, too, in terms of spatial dynamics, and I'm going to let him. He'll talk about that, because we know that what happens in a neighborhood is not just about what happens in that neighborhood, but that there's neighborhood regimes and spatial dynamics, which I talk about a lot. I also talk about individual selection as a social process. I'm going to set that aside because this has to do also with movement. And I make the argument that a lot of the way that we think about selection bias has been somewhat misguided, that it's a nuisance rather than a social process and something to be understood. Moreover, in the way that we typically treat it, in at least two ways, this is not the whole story, but in at least two ways, the way we typically treat it, individual selection is actually a neighborhood effect. Right? One is the sense in which our selection is in a real sense based on context, right? So that we're selecting based on changes in the context, changing composition of a neighborhood, for example, inducing people to move or to stay. Another way is more methodological, but it has to do with the sort of stylistic approach where you control for lots of individual characteristics in looking at a neighborhood relationship and then say, aha, it goes away, therefore it's selection, but in many cases, those individual characteristics that are controlled for are mediating pathways. Causal pathways, and that in fact would bias the analysis. So a little bit on method, but Pat has a paper on this in the AJS, I think it is, right? And there's a paper Felix Elwert in ASR came out last year that shows this very clearly in time-varying models. So that in many different ways we've, I think, been thinking about it incorrectly. But substantively, this is not a method point. I want to point out that through residential migration networks and leadership and organizational networks, sort of part 4 of the book, suggests that we need to think about neighborhood effects in another way. So this is what PHDCN looks like when you follow people over time. Remember, our cohort study, representative sample of children and families in Chicago, they were followed. Something like 43%, almost half of the population moves. It's not a static phenomenon. They move. And we follow them wherever they go, in the United States, Mexico, and interviewed them anywhere. This is a simple, sort of simple diagram that shows the neighborhoods and the ties between them and the flows between them. But I do it visually because I want you to see that actually the city is a flow, right? And so I'm thinking kind of demographically here that we can now think of neighborhoods as a node, because when you move to another neighborhood, you are establishing a tie. And then the greater the movement, the greater the connection between. And so what we do, and what we have done, 1 minute.
Yeah, I'll give you 2.
I saw a 0 added onto that. Is to, first of all, look at the flows and work with Pat. We looked at the flows by type, for example, by race and ethnicity over time. But what you can also do is to then reconceptualize the actual neighborhood and create the neighborhood as a network. And so in part of the book, what I do, and I want to make the substantive point here, that the internal is not sort of in opposition to the external. Because if you take the neighborhood, so imagine now you've got the neighborhoods and you just do a matrix of all ties among the neighborhoods. So take every neighborhood in Chicago and just create a matrix, take out the diagonal, and you have a potential tie between every single neighborhood. Then we have the moves between them. We create the flows between the neighborhood. We count for the proportion that moved out and look at the relationship between how the characteristics of the community, specifically the differences between communities, are influencing whether or not they're tied through a residential migration network. And it turns out that, first of all, the death of distance is wrong in so many dimensions, but it's also wrong in moving. Spatial distance is strongly related to decline, that is to say, less connection. So is income and percent black, and you would expect that, right, in terms of people moving to similar neighborhoods. But what was a bit unexpected and very interesting, I think, is that the social climate and some of these social mechanisms that I'm talking about, particularly now social disorder, perceived disorder, friend kinship ties, these are independently related to the flows between neighborhoods. And I think this has to do with the kinds of information flows that people are talking about, where to move, and norms about what acceptable environments are. Furthermore, I'm just going to go through this real quickly. I want to tie it to another kind of network based on elites. It's not just what people do, but we also, through what's known as KeyNet Chicago, interviewed education, business, religion, law enforcement, political, community organizations. 2 points in time. This is essentially a panel, mover-stayer panel model. And what we can do is then treat the network of leaders as a network. And this is sort of a traditional network of individuals. Bottom line, this is what it looks like when you do the neighborhood. This hasn't really been achieved before in the literature because we haven't had both the technology and I think I'm thinking about it as comparative networks. That is to say, communities vary in their network structure. These are 2 real communities. Hegwish has a very dense web of connections. South Shore has a bunch of isolates and 3 cliques. That configuration, okay, this is a structural kind of cohesion measure at the network level within communities, is related to crime, it's related to other factors. And we can also then go one step further in terms of the higher order structure and look at how the whole city is mapped out. I'm interested in knitting out actually the whole political and network structure of the city. Hegwish may be tight internally, but it's rather weakly tied. So this is, in a way, you can think about Granovetter's weak tie kind of argument. You have internal strong ties, and the weak ties are the extra local ties that communities have or do not. And it turns out that that is related to resources. Okay, so I'm going to conclude and skip over the organizational piece. I was just going to show you that in the last leg was the importance of organizations. This is a rally against violence in Roseland, and basically make the argument that collective civic action is another construct. I'll just end with that. In terms of the theoretical piece, that collective civic action in a community varies tremendously. There's over a 30-year period, the same communities are generating the same intensity of collective action, which tells us a lot, and it's based on organizations. So theoretical implications for research, I think, are just the summary of what I've talked about in terms of hopefully capturing the theme of what I was asked to do, the salience of cultural and social mechanisms, and others are going to talk about these more today. This isn't an exhaustive list. This is a bit, or a lot, obviously, influenced by my own research, but also of others in terms of organizations, collective efficacy, disorder. But the structural cohesion, the leadership networks, and the beyond the local, I think, is worth talking about. In a way, I think about it as just trying to, at a theoretical level, mix across, and we've sort of pitted choice and selection against neighborhood or higher order structures, right? You have, it's all big global structure, state, but it's mediated, and also the individual is influencing through his or her actions the composition itself. So details you could find in what, of course, is a great American city. I didn't say the great American city, but great American city. And I'm just going to leave it at that and turn it over to the discussant. Hopefully, I went just about the right amount of time. Thanks.
Our discussant is Frank Durloff. Stephen Durloff, sorry. Stephen Durloff. Is he here? Okay, there we go. Welcome from University of Wisconsin. Please lead us on.
You bring the slides up?
They're all in here.
Well, while you bring them up, I should mention that actually it's in this room about 15 years ago. I first met Rob Sampson. I was giving a discussion of social interactions, and I was making an argument that statistical evidence is not the only source of knowledge, and I was effusively praising the Sampson Love book, Crime in the Making. I'd never met either of the authors, and to my horror afterwards, I found out what was in the room. That at least verified that what I said was sincere. Okay. That will be true also of what I want to say about this book. How do I make this full screen?
It's to create a new one. This is a PDF, right?
Yeah. Can you just go to view and say full screen? All right, so I'm calling this, so I was asked literally 4 days ago to give a discussion of Rob's book, which of course led to the first issue, which is I had to read it in 24 hours. Pardon me?
Yes, it's a little too long.
That's not a criticism of the book. That is a criticism of the talk in the sense that it's going to be based on an admittedly superficial examination of what Rob has to say. And so I thought what would be most useful is to describe how one economist interpreted the arguments in the book. And so what I'm going to do, unlike Rob, is give you lots of equations, because part of what I'm going to try to do is translate many of the ideas in Rob's book into economist speak, which of course is incomprehensible. But I want to explain to you why the ideas in this book actually naturally fit into the way that modern economic thinking arises. And I emphasize that because in finishing his book, one of the things I was most upset, there's one thing I was upset about, and that was the lack of communication between economists and sociologists. In other words, that there's a huge amount of work in sociology that I've done a bad job of not only citing but integrating into my own research. But I think conversely, there's quite a bit of methodology in economics that is very germane to the sort of work that Rob has been a pioneer. And so that's why I want to try to at least give you my perspective on some of the arguments here. So, The overall view, and this is sincere, not because the author is in the audience. I don't think he would object to saying it's a semi-popular description of a long-standing research program, and that's what he meant. That there's no equations, and there aren't lots of tables and discussions of heterogeneity, robust team statistics, and the
It
like.
would be easier if you stood nearer the microphone for those of us further away.
All right.
Yeah. You don't have to be very close, but.
That doesn't come out of my time, by the way. All right. So the first comment is I do want to express sincere admiration for the book, which I think is really very well written and a very nice and accessible introduction to the important research program that Rob and a number of co-authors have developed. And I think that this praise should be given at several levels. The first, frankly, is simply in the act of data collection. In other words, the Chicago Neighborhood Project is a magisterial achievement in extending the sorts of data that are available to social scientists. And it's often not glamorous work to create data, but it's of first-order significance. And part of the admiration that I think that this research program deserves is the recognition that when one's asking certain types of questions, one necessarily has to ask, how can we expand existing data in order to give satisfactory answers? And they have not only done that, but they have actually created a resource for social science in the future, and that deserves, I think, enormous admiration. The second point I would make about the research program is I think much praise is warranted in thinking about collective efficacy as a social or a neighborhood effect. I say that in several senses. First of all, I think that it does more naturally lend itself to measurement than other broad tent concepts such as social capital. Social capital, I would in fact argue, is proven to be an unhelpful and almost incoherent term. Now, why do I want to make an inflammatory comment like that? Because the evolution of the concept in terms of measurements ended up with two distinct ideas. One, whether or not people trust each other, and two, whether or not there are social networks to transmit information. Trust, since it's associated with trustworthiness, is not even naturally a social concept, or at least logically one. And so social capital, in my view, has not proven to be a success in terms of the translation of some very broad and superficially appealing ideas into really deep social science research. In contrast, the collective efficacy arguments that are developed in the research program are giving measurable and precise mechanisms by which one can understand how social influences translate into individual outcomes. And so that movement is of particular importance to economists because often we define neighborhood effects or social influences by data constructs. In other words, we say it's this percentage of the poverty rate in a neighborhood is the neighborhood effect, or this percentage of managerial and technical workers amongst the adult population. That's the neighborhood effect. In contrast, this is much more theoretically persuasive in that it's actually giving an explanation as to why the neighborhood matters, as opposed to allowing the data, as it were, the conventional suspects that economists use to define what is meant by a social influence. And so I find the idea persuasive, and I believe that it could and will lead to useful formal theorizing by economists as one tries to refine the idea, or you could even say delimit it by trying to write down mathematical formalism for it. Third comment is that I do want to praise this type of work because, frankly, it is big science. And this is a comment about economists more than other social scientists. I think the book properly criticizes some research areas that economists have used to talk about neighborhood effects and have been overhyped, and I think outside the authors are generally recognized not to be particularly informative. But most importantly, the book takes a very strong stance against treating randomized experiments as some sort of gold standard for social science research. I think that tendency in economics is extraordinarily unhealthy. We are social scientists, not medical scientists. We have different questions we need to ask, and that consequently means we need to think about different sources of information. For example, it is a well-posed question to ask what the sources of the causes were for World War I. There is never going to be a randomized experiment that gives us the slightest insight into the answer to that question. Okay, so that gets a laugh line, but the serious point is if we're going to talk about persistent inequality and understand something such as a poverty trap, something such as a dysfunctional neighborhood, that intrinsically is going to lead us away from the world of randomized experiments. That does not mean there is no information in randomized experiments, but rather one has to tailor the type of data one uses, the type of econometric methods or statistical methods I've given the audience one uses, to the question that's going to be asked. And then I think that Rob's book is frankly a slap in the face to, in a positive way, a clarion call is maybe a better way to say it, to social scientists to do bigger science and not treat randomized experiments as the be-all and the end-all, because there is a cost to that, which is the necessary delimitation of social science research to smaller and less policy important questions. All right. So a question naturally, so how would an economist formalize Sampson's vision? So this is a completely self-serving remark. The answer is, I think that in some ways it has been formalized, aspects have been formalized. So I want to describe to you, and this really is self-serving, how William Brock and other co-authors and I have written down models of social interactions and how we've embedded them in models of neighborhood formation. Now, the purpose in doing this is as I said, is to explain to you how we think about the problem, which I think will hopefully be useful to other social scientists, and second, to emphasize that we are asking the same questions. We aren't necessarily using the same language, and we're doing a horrendous job of communicating with each other, but we have a lot to offer each other. All right. Now, from the perspective of formal economic theory of social interactions, there's a certain sense in which the introduction of collective efficacy or any notion of social influences, it represents a methodologically trivial extension of conventional economic reasoning. Now, why do I get to make a kind of a wild statement like that? Because the way that I would make the argument's the following, and that is the irreducible core of economic logic is methodological individualism in the sense of thinking of individuals as making decisions. Okay, that does not mean the decisions are rational, that they exhibit perfect foresight, that they aren't influenced by any particular factor. And so in thinking about those decisions, the way that the literature in social interactions, the mathematical literature has evolved is to say that individual decisions are affected by different classes of factors. One class of factors is the usual suspects, individual specific variables, your father's occupation, so on and so forth. A second class, which is now instantiated in the social interactions literature, are called contextual effects, of which collective efficacy could be an example. And only notion there is simply to say that if you're measuring individuals and you think of them as members of some sort of collectivity, I index them as G because in the way that I develop these models, discrete units in which people interact, i.e. neighborhoods, are called groups in the mathematics. These are simply objects that affect everybody. Okay, so in other words, if there's a overall level of informal social control that affects everybody, that's a candidate for Y. Another factor that affects everybody are the perceptions you have about how others are going to behave. That captures some of Rob's ideas in terms of social norms and the like. In other words, I make decisions on how to behave based on what I think others are going to do. I could obviously create a higher level argument there and say, I make decisions on behavior based on how I think people are going to respond to what I do. That's just, the mechanism of how you enforce social norms. But the whole point is that one thinks of it logically as a distinct determinant of decision making, which is based on the beliefs of the behaviors of others. And again, even though I will talk in scalars mathematically, you can do everything in whatever dimension you want and talk about all the interconnections between choices. And so that's the sense in which this is a very natural language for asking about correlated behaviors at a neighborhood level. Finally, and this is, again, self-servingly, when I do theory, I have one rule, and that is if you write down a theoretical model, the equilibrium must be mathematically equivalent to a likelihood function. In other words, there could be no gap between how you theorize and how you do empirical work. And so in the spirit of that, I'll say my philosophy of science with a very little p, two types of heterogeneity are always built into the models. One's going to be individual specific. In other words, the idea there's simply things about individuals that I as an analyst have to treat as unknown. And as a theorist, I think of them as being drawn from some probability measure, but that's all I want to say about it. And then the other thing is that if I'm thinking about neighborhoods or these discrete groups, I want to allow for unobservables that exist at this higher level of aggregation. All right, so if you add all that together, I claim there's nothing new. I could teach this in introductory economics. I would just say people make decisions, but they are decisions that are influenced by a broader conception of the determinants of behavior than is conventional in economic models. All right, so message number one is I don't see any logical incompatibility between the vision Rob has articulated and how we think about, how economists sort of think about what are called micro-foundations. Comment number two. Once you begin to take these types of models and actually try to develop them. I mean, now you can actually, I think, learn things that aren't obvious from verbal theorizing. So given the time, I'm going to skip a large number of slides. Okay, so blah, 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 blah. All it says is that one can prove things. Okay. I set up an environment. All right? So the thought experiment is individuals are affected by the behaviors of others, and they're affected by various aggregate level variables. And you might say, so what's new? So what does it mean to say there's an equilibrium? Well, okay, so just to be clear, when an economist says there's an equilibrium, he's not saying things are in a steady state. What he's saying is that there's some notion of how the interdependencies in behavior are adjudicated. Those of you that took introductory economics already know how you do it in a market. A price equilibrates supply and demand. In the context of a social environment, behaviors have to reflect some sort of self-consistency. In other words, if people have one set of beliefs, they have to ask the question, in what sense are those, do we assume that the beliefs get ratified ex post or they don't get ratified? So one takes a stance on the way in which beliefs are formed, you put all that together, and you come up with a collection of behaviors that's consistent with those micro-foundations. Now here's the key points relative to Rob's work. First of all, when you write down these formal mathematical models, what you end up with when you strip them down, and as a theorist, you're allowed to make every simplifying assumption possible in order to get the idea across. The empirical work is hard because then I have to put in all the heterogeneity that naturally adheres to individuals, both at the individual and the group level. Idea number one would be the following, and that is when you write down these formal models, what you discover is that there are three key parameters that determine the behavior of the average person in a neighborhood. One of them is going to be Econ 101, and that is private incentives. In other words, you have some measure of whether or not you ought to do A or B. I'm going to be talking about binary choices for simplicity, and private incentives, their average level matters. The second thing is less obvious, and that is the variance of the unobserved heterogeneity matters. In communities in which you have a lot of Mozarts, that's going to matter in terms of having these outliers that are influencing individual outcomes. And the third factor is the intensity of the social interactions. And so what happens remarkably in these models is you have an interplay of the first and second moments of the individual characteristics and the strength of the social characteristics, and you get what are mathematically called phase transitions, but in jargon are simply threshold effects. And I'll be of the form, if social intensity is above a certain level, you get multiple equilibria for the same neighborhood. That's defined as multiple average behaviors compatible with the same micro-foundations. That's why you can have two neighborhoods that look observably the same in terms of poverty, yet have very different levels of outcomes such as criminality and the like. Second comment is what is going to be necessary for this potential for multiplicity? It's low private incentives. In other words, you don't have individual versus social explanations. It's their interplay that can produce these interesting phenomena such as multiple equilibria. An unfancy way of saying that is, I'm not worried about the graduation rate at Beverly Hills High School. The private incentives are going to overcome any sort of conformity effect with respect to the decisions. All right, that's comment one. Comment two, the entire thought experiment presupposes that when we talk about things such as a bad neighborhood and the like, these are statistical regularities over populations of heterogeneous actors. They are not statements about the individuals. All right, I'm taking one extra minute. Okay. The logit assumptions, since I didn't give them to you, they were there, they don't matter. Every statement I make would prove for arbitrary probability statements. Again, the idea is you make things as simple as possible and then you generalize. What I want to end with is I could take Rob's model and the natural defect relative to what he talked about is there's no theory here of how the neighborhoods form. So, how do economists, it's the answer. The answer an economist always gives is if there's a choice and you think it ought to be modeled, do it. And so one can write down a full-blown model in which neighborhoods form and in which behaviors occur once the neighborhoods are formed. And so there's a bunch of mathematics by which I can do that. And so what messages would I take from that? Number one, that these formal models absolutely adhere to the Sampson requirement, and that is that the social and behavioral factors co-generate both the neighborhoods and the individual outcomes. In other words, when people choose the neighborhoods, they're thinking about what the neighborhood is. It isn't just a coincidence that property values are higher in Beverly Hills than they are in the neighborhood around Crenshaw High School in Los Angeles. All right, and so in that sense, I think there really is a parallel between what Rob's doing and what is the state of the frontier in the social interactions literature. I actually don't think identity economics is about that, so I officially chastise you for your footnote. Okay, second comment. Endogenous versus contextual effects are critical in understanding when you can get things such as multiple equilibria. And that's one of the identification problems which the book at least elides over a little bit. And if you think, and what I mean by that is in terms of the econometrics, how do you identify the social factors? There's really three issues. The first is how do you disentangle, when there's simultaneity, different mechanisms. That's a classical problem. Mansky calls it the reflection problem. You quoted something called the looking glass problem, so it turns out that's a good metaphor. Good news, the reflection problem can be proven mathematically to be non-generic. It only occurs in an isolated set of models, and it is simply not, the case that the literature focused on is a mathematical curiosity. Second problem is the second problem is unobserved group characteristics. That's actually the hardest one, and why you need you need panel data, because to say that there are these group characteristics, to say there's stuff I know nothing about, I'm going to need 2 more minutes, I'm sorry. I did drive 3 hours to get here, so that's why I get to be obnoxious. Okay. That's the stuff it's hardest to deal with because you don't have any theory about it. In other words, it's simply this residual, annoying aggregate heterogeneity, and that's why panel data helps, because you can quasi-difference it out, and so on and so forth. The third issue is self-selection. In other words, you worry that a neighborhood is a group of people that have some correlated, unobserved characteristic. This is where I'll chastise you a little bit on language. I would prefer you not say that a self-selection is a neighborhood effect, but rather say self-selection reflects neighborhood effects because people choose neighborhoods given those phenomena. Now, the reason I want to say it that way is because it turns out, interestingly enough, that one can show that there are environments in which you can't identify the neighborhood effects when there's random assignment of individuals across neighborhoods, but if there is self-selection into the neighborhoods and there is selection on the unobserved heterogeneity, you can identify it. And this is why Rob's talk I was closer to in my spirit than the language in the book. Self-selection, along with the behavior in the neighborhoods, helps you triangulate the magnitude of the neighborhood effects. And so this is what I meant when I said the idea that randomized experiments are somehow a gold standard really is the wrong way for social scientists to think. Behaviors provide information, and the mechanism by which neighborhoods form help identify what occurs in the neighborhoods. And in that sense, that's what the message I want to give. So since there's only maximum of 3 economists in the room, I can't see that well. I'm going to say I benefited a lot. I'm sure Jens would, and if I've missed an economist, I do apologize. Bottom line, this is really a brilliant, and I mean that, important research program, and we need to start talking.
We're going to go for about 10 minutes, and the floor is open for questions. Yes, Jim.
Question for Professor Sampson. I wanted to know if you thought it was ever, or some examples of when you think it's inappropriate to call some part of urban space a neighborhood, where sometimes it's not sensible or analytically useful to consider every part of urban space a neighborhood.
Yeah, interesting question. I talk a fair bit about the concept of neighborhood in the book and different ways to measure it. I start out with a theoretical definition of neighborhood as a geographical section of a larger community, usually containing residents, institutions with distinctive social characteristics. So, in that sense, the definition of neighborhood is spatial, and the properties of social organization are variable. So, in other words, some would have neighborhoods be defined by a certain kind of social interactional structure, like typing in social ties, if that's a neighborhood. I think that as the social property, that is the neighborhoodness, if you will. It's kind of like thinking about Rogers Brubaker talks about the nation. I mean, the boundaries are constructed and are, quote, artificial, but yet the nationness, or in the case of the neighborhood, is something you can think of. So You might think of a neighborhood, it's interesting because I had some graduate students pose a similar sort of question. We were looking in Boston at areas that were sort of like no man's land, where people would say, well, it's not a neighborhood, right? But in a sense, that's an odd way to think about it. In a sense, that's a quality to the space that I would think of as real, right? So it may be that there's no one living there, or there's fear, or there's a sense that no one is perceived as responsible for that space. And in fact, the original experiment, it's a little bit of an aside, but I think it's relevant. The original experiment behind the whole broken windows idea that Kelling and Wilson referred to, that Zimbardo did back in the 1960s when they put the car, they jacked it up to see if anyone would vandalize it. In the Bronx, it was ravaged within 10 minutes. In Palo Alto, nothing happened. They referred to it as kind of this, anonymity of place, no man's land, that really wasn't a space. It wasn't, quote, a neighborhood. So it's a long answer to say that I conceive of, conceive of a space, even if it doesn't have the traditional social qualities. So the analytic units in the book are geographic, but they're scaled in multiple ways. I really think a neighborhood almost in a fractal sense. It's like a place where you have small, micro neighborhoods, larger neighborhoods, and even communities that have political meaning and have boundaries that are imposed by outsiders, by politics, and so forth. So I take a scalable notion of neighborhood in that sense.
Joe Gillespie.
Rob?
Yeah.
One thing that's always struck me about your agenda is your inattention to the suburbs and thinking of the suburbs as part of a metropolitan reality. Not in the Southwest where I'm from, there's very little distinction, for example, between Los Angeles City and the suburbs that are part of Los Angeles, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Mesa. There's no distinction between them. There really isn't. And so I've always wondered what your either theoretical rationale or your practical reasons have been in order to restrict your analysis of Chicago, for example, to these community areas.
Yeah.
If you might want to move up to the microphone. We're trying to find a handout. Do you want to move up to so you can make comments so people can hear? Can you hear? Yeah.
Come on up, Steve.
Please speak up. Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay. Great question, Joe. If we had been given more money, we would have done it. Practical. No, seriously, that was really it. The notion was we were trying to find a place that could contain the original research design. However, we follow people wherever they moved, and we do have people in the suburbs. We're looking at that, and in fact, the current variation on this project is a new wave of data collection that's following people. Now we have people, scattered all over the country, and we're following up some people in Los Angeles to compare a different kind of urban form. I'm very interested in the suburbs, and in fact, a lot of the processes that I talked about in terms of neighborhood change, and in particular housing, so the tear down of Robert Taylor homes, the plan for transformation, for those of you who don't know about that, Chicago Housing Authority has undergone a complete transformation, and many people are moving to these very places you're talking about. So the south suburbs have changed, seeing an influx of residents. And really the old model of the inner city doesn't really hold anymore. When we talk about inner city poverty, well, some of the most high levels of poverty are now, and have been actually for a while, in places like Harvey, right? Outside the city limits. Actually, the poorest suburb or tract in the United States, as of the 1990 census, was in Ford Heights, which is about 30 miles south of the Loop. So, totally with you. It's not theoretical. It was more a practical limitation of the research. The current research is thinking along those lines. And by the way, the Chicago, non-Chicago distinction is important, and I think it relates to the notion of what you might think of as hard and soft boundaries, right? So that there's certain boundaries, let's say neighborhood boundaries, that are somewhat soft, and again, people will perceive different boundaries, but yet, no matter what you perceive, when you move across the Chicago line, that's a hard boundary in terms of school districts, policing, and any number of other things. And I think that makes a big difference. And one of the analysis from the project showed that in moving, this paper with Pat Sharkey called Destination Effects, that even when you condition on the neighborhood poverty, race and so forth, that kids' exposure to violence, just moving outside, just crossing that line has an effect. And we think that has something to do with exposure to violence in schools. So that dimension is crucially important.
Kim Frank?
Yeah, so picking up on the idea of the equilibrium effect and playing it into what you do, Rob, I'm curious about your ideas about where the other people are in the neighborhood and how I see them. I saw the networks of the elites, but here I show up at the street corner and I kind of, I see the things on the street corner, but I also see these other people, and not just as sort of props, but I see them, on this street corner here, and that grocery store there, and that church over there. I wonder how you think about how those people got there and how they affect what my behavior, my beliefs about collective efficacy or something like that.
Why don't we collect, we had one or two other hands, we only got 2 minutes. Why don't we collect two, we had a few other hands, questions? Yeah.
And this is related to maybe this is good. I'm interested how you think about people moving, not permanently, but on a daily basis out of neighborhoods. I mean, in Chicago, for example, very different movement in and out on a 24-hour basis for people who live in some neighborhoods as opposed to others. And I'm wondering how you think about neighborhood effects on their health or violence or these other outcomes that are contained within these neighborhood boundaries for people who may spend 3 hours, 4 hours, 12 hours outside the neighborhood every day versus people who are spending practically 24/7 within the same neighborhood, or maybe, as you put it, neighborhood regimes, and how you would either account for that here or what your suggestions are for future research to account for that.
Okay.
John Levy-Martin?
Yeah, and so both Durloff and Sampson make this, seems to be the big theoretical choice, especially if you're doing some individual modeling, is whether to start from enclosed neighborhoods and consider people to be properly nested in them, or whether to start from individuals and go outwards and not have to do this like Irvine approach. And I'd like to hear you justify why, given individual level data, to impose neighborhoods as opposed to each person have their own space.
Last?
I can save mine.
Okay, good. All right, well, I've got a minute or so.
Okay. Over beers.
The big ones.
So, yeah, I mean, the movement, Frank, issue in terms of, what people are seeing in the nature of the movement and the elites, I think there's a lot going on there, and one thing that I did look at, which suggests to me that there's really sort of a fundamental nature to some of these flows or ties between neighborhoods, sort of information flows, and things that are not only that can be seen, but things that sort of can't be seen. And that is that the linkages among the neighborhoods are such that the ties when people are moving, right, are also connected to the information flows among elites, which I think was a bit of an unexpected finding as well. So in other words, it's not just what's going on up there in terms of the politicians, but rather everyday actions on the part of individuals are also connected structurally in terms of that way, even over long distances. So that suggests to me, and I use the analogy of something like a river, where you have these currents and things that you don't see. It's almost like an undertow, right? Or things you kind of step in and you don't notice that you're being carried along. And I think a lot of it is unconscious in the sense that there are these flows, but it's not just about people moving, it's about information, it's about resources, and that's really central to understand. And so at a theoretical level, that's what that section of the book tries to get at. In terms of the question of activity, as I understand the question, so let me reinterpret it, that in any given day we're in multiple neighborhoods, right? So that to me is an important point. I totally agree with that. But it suggests we need to reconceptualize neighborhood effects too, right? Because the traditional neighborhood effect is, well, what is the effect of me growing up in poverty on some outcome? That's important, but it's not the only one. That's why I refer to the idea of a family of neighborhood effects in the book that have to do not just with effects on individuals, but neighborhood change as a unit of analysis, but also if I'm in another neighborhood, it has nothing to do with where I live, that can still influence me. So kids after school are in a particular park that is more supervised or less, which will influence behavior. So I think getting into routine activity patterns, and Chris, I think, is going to have something to say about this, that we need to look at networks of how people are moving. I envision neighborhood effects very broadly, that's important. I also have a colleague in England who actually just has a book coming out on this, not just on this, but looking at adolescent patterns of activity and characteristics of the individual, and then where he or she lives, and then the characteristics of, for example, the collective efficacy in different neighborhoods where they are located in space, and showing that there are interaction effects. And in some cases, it may not be the neighborhood that you live in at all. So I think we've reified a certain kind of neighborhood effect in the literature that, while important, is not the only one, and we really need to think more broadly about it. And then in terms of the question of
30 seconds? Sorry.
Okay, yeah, starting...
We're 4 minutes over time.
Yeah, starting with the individual. Well, I'm interested, first of all, in neighborhoods and space and place as important elements of analysis in and of themselves. And I think, in a way, you're getting at sort of a methodological individualist type of question. And I actually have a section in the book that talks about that and why I think it's problematic. We can ask people to define what their own neighborhoods are, and that's been done. I don't think it's a very useful research agenda. First of all, you get lots of different answers. You can draw different neighborhood boundaries, but social structure has its effects regardless of whether it's registered in people's minds, is one way that one might think about that, so that the structure of those places is important independently. And so the agenda, in part, is to try to understand those effects. That doesn't mean the cognitive is unimportant. That's why I try to build that in a very important way. But I just wanted to say, in relation to Steve's comments, which I enjoyed very much, please don't tell my sociology friends that my book has something to say to economists. I'm only kidding.
Can I answer the other question?
I really think that the talking back and forth is incredibly important, and sociologists are just as to blame.
Well, I of course have long complained that sociologists look down on economists, so I'm glad about your mea culpa. In answer to the last question, the way that I would think about it, well, one answer is read my latest paper. And what I mean by that is a different vision of how to talk about social interactions is to think of each individual as having, within a population, interactions with or some social relationship with every other person. That becomes a particular type of social network. Then one asks, well, what can I learn at that level of generality? In the theory, the answer is little. In the empirics, zero, because we can't measure the damn things, because that would require too many parameters, as it were, relative to the number of observations. The paper and the reason I said read my paper is that one then asks the following question. Suppose I have partial observability of the underlying social structure. In other words, there's something about neighborhoods that I assert you would agree makes them a meaningful notion of an aggregate to look at. And I interpret your question as saying that you want me to go beyond some block diagonal vision of the pairwise interactions, and the answer is one starts with one set of assumptions where the blocks literally don't interact. Rob doesn't like that, but as he shouldn't, because that means you need a temporal dimension. That's how I would model that. Then one begins to generalize and ask, what can one learn under weaker restrictions on the way that interactions occur? And so, again, self-servingly, my research program in econometrics is to map out the assumptions possibility frontier. And so I think your point's well taken, and it turns out there's more that you can say that you might have expected.
Okay. End of the first session. Thank you.